that is targeting the Latin East, and look at another example of how the crusade becomes sort of used as a tool to pursue sort of religious goals within Western Europe itself. And so this is the Albigensian Crusade. There are a number of sort of illustrations of this, and this is one of them. So you can see the knights there, and then the Albigensians, who I'll talk about in a bit. So the Albigensian Crusade is launched by Pope Innocent III, and you can see him pictured here. He was actually one of the youngest of all the medieval popes, and a very ambitious sort of papal agenda. A number of scholars sort of identify Innocent as sort of reaching the height of papal power in Western Europe. And this is not just sort of religious power, but also his ability to sort of implement a secular agenda as well. And so a number of sort of wider goals that he pursued. So establishing sort of religious uniformity across Europe. One of the things that's happened is now that almost everyone within Western Europe is Christian, to make sure that they're the right kind of Christian, according to the views of the Orthodox Catholic Church. Also strengthening papal authority. A number of these sort of opportunities he pursues that sort of he calls crusades don't just sort of establish religious uniformity, but they also strengthen papal authority as well. And he very much views the crusade as a tool of papal policy, not just, as I said, to accomplish religious goals, but also he uses it in a very political fashion at times, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And so what you then have is this conflation of sort of religion and political action under sort of a single sort of goal that becomes known as crusade. So a number of the crusades that are launched by Innocent, the Fourth Crusade in 1198, which is intended to target Jerusalem. He also announces a crusade against a nobleman, Marquard of Anouilh, who he is in a dispute with. And when Marquard refuses to back down, Innocent sort of uses the tool of crusade to try and overcome his opposition. Whether or not that would have worked is unknown, because shortly after the crusade is called, Marquard dies. He is also an active supporter of some of the campaigns in Iberia, pictured here. So this is modern day Spain. Increasingly, the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia have been making inroads into the Muslim-controlled territory in the central and south part of Iberia. And it's under Innocent that a major sort of turning point occurs at the Battle of La Navas de Tolosa in 1212. And a number of sort of kings of the Christian kingdoms in the north sort of come together and unite forces. And we know that the rest of the medieval period is going to see what's left of Muslim-occupied Spain sort of gradually diminish. So in part, Innocent, again sort of pictured here, is changes papal approach to crusading. He really does want a more active role in the planning, with mixed success, as we'll see particularly in the Fourth Crusade. He also really does sort of approach crusading as this sort of group effort, that it isn't just the individuals who actually go. It's sort of the responsibility of everyone within Europe to sort of make sure that they're not only supportive of these endeavors, but they're sort of helping contribute. And a lot of that contribution from average people comes in the form of sort of living these penitent lives. So if success is the direct result of God's favor, then you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to secure that favor. So fasting, confessing, making local pilgrimage. These are all ways that individuals who do not have the means to go on crusade can indirectly participate. The other innovation under Innocent is commuting the vows. So crusading, if you take the vow, remember you get sort of a remission of sins. And those who go on crusade then go sort of directly to heaven. And so what he does is he sort of changes this a little bit. And instead of actually going, you can contribute money to those who do go, and then you can receive an indulgence. So an indulgence is sort of a papal dispensation for sin. And the crusade going is obviously the ultimate. You go right to heaven, but there are different sort of gradations of indulgences. So 40 days, 60 days, a year. And depending on how much money you contribute, that's how significant the indulgence is that you receive from the Pope. And he also does sort of establish a direct tax collected by churches throughout Europe to help raise funds to support all of these disparate crusades that he is championing. So the causes of the Albigensian Crusade in particular are well, the Albigensian Crusade is sort of a tricky one because scholars really disagree over the exact nature of the group that is targeted by the Crusaders. So this is sort of the general consensus view. So Albigensian is the term that comes from the city of Albi, which is sort of at the heart of a lot of these movements that are then known collectively as Cathars. Cathars are so that's a term that's attributed to individuals who seem to adhere to a certain set of beliefs that the Catholic Church does not sanction. It's important to remember, however, that Cathars would have identified as Christians, as Catholics even, and a lot of the people that shared these communities with them would have also identified as Catholics. So what we think sort of sets them apart in their beliefs, they seem to be dualist. So one of the biggest challenges in Christianity is understanding the source of evil. So if God is all good and the source of all things, how do you explain the presence of evil in the world? And so Cathars believed in sort of two divinities, one the source of good and one the source of evil. They also believed that the physical world was where sin resided. So anything associated with the physical world was inherently evil, including the body and everything necessary to sustain the body. So it's a very anti-materialist rejection of wealth, but also a rejection of everything needed to live. So no food, no drink. When they reached sort of a certain state of perfection, no sex, because sex led to other human beings. And so certain people within the community at a certain point would declare their intention to sort of fully realize this ideal, and so reject food, reject anything necessary to sustain the body. And then these individuals had a special designation and they were known as perfecti. There's also a strong anti-clerical sentiment amongst these people. I think this is the one element that almost all scholars can agree on. In particular, a lot of critique of local priests and bishops who said one thing and then did another. Particularly things like clerical celibacy, priests not supposed to have sex, but yet they knew of a number of local priests who were actively involved in relationships with women. So, demanding that priests sort of hold themselves to a higher standard of behavior. Another practice that sometimes is associated with these individuals is a consolamentum, and this is an illustration of that practice here. It's sort of like their version of a baptism. So when an individual decides they want to enter this sort of final state and become a perfecti, the consolamentum, or sort of laying on of hands, is performed. They seem to also, because of this issue of sin, and that the body itself is inherently sinful, have argued that Jesus wasn't an actual human being because he would have been sinful. He was rather just a vision. And then rejecting some of these sort of ceremonies within Catholic theology, like baptism, like the Mass, and in part of the rejection of sort of clerical behavior and authority altogether. We do not have any writings from these Cathars themselves. The only writings we have are from Christian sources who describe them, which is one of the reasons why it's so tricky to figure out what they actually believed. But what we do know is that they were almost uniformly identified by other members of their communities by the term good men or good women. So this does kind of give you a sense of how esteemed they were by the other, like, non-Cathars just within their communities. So why does this happen where it happens? It's really contained to this region in southern France. And in part, that region is really sort of distinct from the north. So linguistically, they speak a very different dialect. It also has a much different culture influenced by proximity to Iberia, to Italy, and the Mediterranean. There was for a long time a sort of a belief that this actually spreads from the east up through sort of Constantinople and across sort of some of those territories in Eastern Europe. I don't think scholars any longer sort of adhere to that, but there was some suspicion. In part, there is just sort of this general lack of attention by the papacy to a lot of these areas. They concentrate their sort of focus further north, but there is across Italy, across parts of southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries, this sort of movement, this very sort of religious movement where people are sort of reacting to what they consider corruption amongst the clergy and expressing a desire to live a much more sort of truly religious lifestyle without having to enter a monastery or without having to enter a nunnery. So it seems to be part of some of those larger sort of reform currents. Also, in terms of the politics of this region, it is really messy. Technically, these are all vassals of the King of France, but they don't necessarily acknowledge his immediate authority. So you have the Counts of Toulouse, the Raymonds, who are going to be part of this, the Viscount of Beziers, Raymond Roger Trinqueval, and then you also have the Counts of Foix. So these are all sort of leading sort of political authorities in the region who the Pope has said, particularly to the Count of Toulouse, look, you need to do something about this. I hear rumors that these people are here. You need to eradicate them. They're heretics. And these sort of local political figures don't necessarily see these people as causing any harm, so they don't do anything about it. You also, as I said before, even though technically they are part of the Kingdom of France, they've never really acknowledged the actual authority of the kings of France. And so they sort of are very much independent. And then in part because this region is sort of so separate from France, what we see is that ideas spread fairly easily. And when there is no political authority cracking down on them or religious authority, they can sort of cover a lot of ground quickly. You also have in this region this sort of topographical configuration that again sort of lends itself to sort of this isolation. So these castra, these sort of walled cities, which as you can see here, this is Foix, is going to be very easy to defend. So that's the citadel in the middle, is also surrounded by mountains. So in many ways, these people are sort of cut off from a lot of the other sort of communication that happens across France. And two more examples, we'll talk specifically about Carcassonne and then also Lastou up in the mountains. So these places really do remain sort of these independent strongholds in the south. So initially, what we see is as these people and their ideas come to the attention of church authorities, the response is, okay, it's just lack of education. It's just misinformation. We need bishops to go in there and actually take their job seriously, provide more oversight, visit these local parishes and see what these priests are saying. But in part, that doesn't really work because the bishops are very dismissive of the local priests. This one quote is from a bishop who describes a local priest of Carcassonne. They're dumb as dogs. They're not educated. They're useless because if someone comes to them with a theological question, they're not educated enough to even answer it. And so what the Pope first starts to do is engage in this intellectual combat, his words. So to send in highly educated monks, so members of the Cistercian order. Dominic, who eventually will establish the Dominican order, is a canon who's also commissioned to go in and just investigate. And this is the origins of the medieval Inquisition, but it just means there's no torture. It just means to inquire. So you go, you ask these people what they believe. If those beliefs are inconsistent with the beliefs of the Catholic Church, you explain why, and then ideally you convince them that their position is wrong and yours is right. This is another image, and so you can see these monks sort of watching as the consolamentum is performed by some Cathars. That doesn't work. Increasingly, these Cistercians and canons come back, report back to the Pope, and say we're not able to make any inroads, very ineffective. And so this is when the military response becomes an issue. So in 1209, Innocent officially calls for a crusade. He wants to eradicate these individuals who he considers heretics. He promises remission of sins and protection of lands if you leave them behind. So the same types of the same types of leverage he has over crusades to the Latin East. A different incentive, though, is if you're part of the confiscation of lands of any local officials who resist, including the Count of Toulouse, you will get to keep said lands. Any possessions you might take in the process, you will keep. And because this is a lot closer to home, there are a lot more individuals who see this as sort of viable material gain. He also, in response to sort of a lackluster initial response, says 40 days. If you promise to go and participate for 40 days, you will have all of these benefits. So the individuals who sort of lead the papal efforts are sort of papal representatives that join the soldiers. Pierre de Castelnau, who is the papal legate, that should say 1208. Pierre de Castelnau was dispatched by the Pope in that early stage, right before the call of the military crusade. And what he was hoping to do was he was hoping to sort of convince these people of the error of their ways, and there was a scuffle and he was killed. And in part it was his death that angered the Pope so much that he issued the military call. You also have Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Citeaux. Arnaud Amalric is there in part as the representative of the Pope, and Pierre de Vaudecernay is also a papal legate, and he writes an eyewitness history, and so he provides one of the key sources of our knowledge of this. So in terms of responses, in 1209, when he first issues the call for crusade, he doesn't get much of a response. He thinks in particular the King of France is going to be excited, but remember the King of France was part of that third crusade. He has other issues, and so it's really the regional nobility that then is targeted. The person who really steps up is Simon de Montfort. Simon de Montfort was part of the Fourth Crusade, but sort of had some issues with that. And so he agrees to sort of lead a contingent of armed soldiers against some of these Cathars. And then this is when the Pope says, okay, just give me 40 days. And then he is able to succeed in getting more recruits. So the first sort of focus here is the Trencavel lands, and in particular the walled city of Béziers, which is pictured here. What they do is they destroy absolutely everything around the city and force the people living in these rural areas to seek refuge in the city. The idea is it's going to be a war of attrition because you're not going to breach these walls. And so ultimately, if you destroy all their food and provisions and they face famine, they'll be forced to surrender. We know that Arnaud Amalric was part of the army that was attacking Béziers. Eventually, they were able to breach the walls, and you've got about 10,000 people still left in Béziers. only a fraction of them are probably Cathars. When the soldiers say to the locals, identify who the Cathars are so we can remove them from the population and kill them, everyone else says, no, we're not going to tell you. They're our neighbors, they're our friends. And so our Noah Malric's response is, kill them all and God will know his own. And so it's just absolute slaughter and pillage and destruction in Béziers. They next turn their attention to the walled city of Carcassonne. Eventually, after an extended siege, the city is captured. Raymond Roger, who is the Viscount, surrenders and then dies shortly after while in prison. The Raymond Rogers titles are granted to Simon de Montfort as the leader of this army. Most of the nobles leave for the winter because you don't really fight over the winter. And in part because he still refuses to cooperate, the Pope excommunicates Raymond of Toulouse. So the next major phase then is when we start to see Simon de Montfort, and so this is him pictured here, really sort of press his military conquest one by one. A lot of these cities surrender because they know what happened at Béziers. And then he's also able to sort of attempt to alter the culture of the region, impose northern law, trying to focus on putting pressure on Raymond of Toulouse. Unfortunately, even though Simon de Montfort is making gains during this stage, he's losing papal support because of events that are happening in the Latin East. So the Pope is sort of turning his attention back there. A significant turning point, though, happens in 1213 at the Battle of Muret. Peter of Aragon, he's the King of Aragon in Iberia, so a very powerful local ruler who joins forces with the Counts of Toulouse and Foix. And so this is a really sort of significant pitched battle, but they end up being defeated quite decisively by Simon de Montfort. And so Peter of Aragon in particular sort of decides he's no longer going to get involved in these affairs. So the southern French lose that important sort of support. And then increasingly, Simon de Montfort is able to press his advantage, to the point that the Fourth Lateran Council, which is a big church council, in 1215, excommunicates Raymond of Toulouse and declares Simon de Montfort the new Count of Toulouse. And you do, during this period, in part because of all the success, start to see more and more recruits. Most of them probably there for just sort of material gain, but they do sort of join the effort. In 1216, then, Innocent III dies, and this is also going to erode some of the support. And then in 1218, Simon de Montfort himself dies. And so at that time, even though his son Amaury attempts to sort of continue to lead the army, Simon de Montfort was really the glue that held everyone together. And so increasingly, they have a hard time recruiting forces. And we do see accounts in some of these places, Cathars who fled the cities, sort of returning. And eventually Amaury himself leaves. He's become increasingly reliant on mercenaries. He just doesn't have the forces that he needs to continue to press his advantage. In the final phase, however, this is sort of the decisive phase, Louis VIII, who succeeded as King of France after Philip II dies, does agree to pursue the war. He recognizes that extending the authority of the king over the southern part of the kingdom is really essential. And so he's able to seize the major city of Avignon, which is just sort of the central heart of southern France, and also the fortress of Beaucaire. And eventually, in spite of initial resistance, the Count of Toulouse does surrender. He surrenders, and in return for sort of penitence, apologies, and some concessions, he does get his title back. In 1229, then they negotiate the Treaty of Paris. So Raymond gets some of the land back in the south, though not all of it. He agrees to support royal officials who are going to sort of monitor the area, and also military garrisons. He agrees to pay reparations and to establish a university in Toulouse. Universities are, all of the sort of professors are members of the church. And so the belief is if you have this sort of educated clerical presence in these places, it'll prevent the spread of heresy in the future. So in terms of outcome, gradually you do see For the most part, these groups no longer have the size or the numbers. A lot of the so-called perfecti are apparently executed at various places. And according to the Catholic accounts, any sort of infrastructure, particularly individuals in the movement who could bring other people into the movement, they're no longer there. And so it isn't sort of passed out down through generation to generation. And the extent to which people do survive, they probably are just very well integrated into the population and sort of hard to identify as adhering to these slightly different beliefs. There is a lot of pushback across Western Europe. There are a number of officials who are very critical of the Pope, who do not believe that this is the appropriate application of the Crusade ideology. And so Innocent III and the papacy generally is going to take a big hit. Also, just the brutality of these attacks, particularly because they were against other Christians, really does shock a lot of people. And it's becoming increasingly clear as the crusade progresses that those who are involved really aren't there because of spiritual motivation. They're there because they see sort of a material advantage. It does, however, extend the royal authority of the king over that part of southern France that until now has always been sort of a holdout. The very last sort of stand of the Cathars is here at the Fortress of Montségur in right sort of that in the Pyrenees between France and modern day Spain. Gradually, reports filter back to the Pope that there is a community of Cathars who sought refuge here. The Pope says, look, if you recant your beliefs, I will spare your lives. I will grant you free passage outside of the city. They refuse. Eventually, an army sort of lays siege. Many of them die of starvation, and those who survive eventually take their own lives. And so this is just a commemoration of what happens at Mount Segur. So you can see how the army sort of surrounded them and eventually managed to build a causeway to get sort of siege equipment up to the walls. And then this is the monument that's there today, sort of commemorating this last stand of the Cathars.